For 600 years, one empire operated under an official law that made murder a sacred duty. Every time a new ruler took the throne, he held the legal right to have silk cords wrapped around the necks of every one of his own brothers, strangling them one by one to prevent a civil war before it could even begin. Brothers killing brothers, not as scandal, but as state policy, written into law and blessed by religious scholars. This same empire built a cannon 8 meters long, dragged it across mountains by moonlight, and used it to smash through walls that had turned back every army for over 1,000 years, finally silencing the last echo of the Roman Empire itself. For 6 centuries, the mere mention of this empire's advancing armies was enough to make the capitals of Europe tremble. And then, astonishingly, this same unstoppable war machine collapsed. Historians called it the sick man of Europe. How did the most feared military power on the planet decay into a joke whispered in the palaces of its former enemies? And how did a secret decision made by just 3 men, signed one day after a world war had already begun, wipe an empire that had survived 600 years completely off the map? Buried in the archives of Istanbul, opened to researchers only in the 1990s, sits the paper trail of that decision. Telegrams between a war minister and a foreign emperor, proof that entering the deadliest conflict in human history to that point was not an accident, not a trap sprung by outsiders, but a calculated gamble placed by 3 men who never even told their own sultan what they had signed. In the closing years of the 13th century, the region known as Anatolia was a land without a master. The once mighty Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome itself, had spent centuries decaying, its territory shrinking with every generation, its armies weaker with every passing decade. From the east came a different kind of pressure entirely, the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of the Mongol invasions, sweeping through Central Asia and the Middle East, scattering populations and toppling ancient states in their path. Caught between a crumbling empire and an unstoppable one, Anatolia had become a chaotic frontier zone, home to dozens of small Turkic warrior bands, each carving out whatever territory it could hold. Among these countless minor tribal leaders was a man named Osman, chief of a small, unremarkable Turkic clan operating along the very edge of Byzantine territory. There was nothing in 1299, the year traditionally marking the founding of his dynasty, to suggest that Osman's obscure frontier principality would one day grow into one of the largest and longest-lasting empires the world has ever known. Byzantine chroniclers barely bothered to record his name, dismissing him as just another minor raider among many along a border already crowded with similar figures. What set Osman and his followers apart was a powerful ideological framework binding their military campaigns to religious purpose. They fought under the banner of Gaza, a concept of holy war against non-Muslim territory that carried both spiritual reward and practical appeal. This framing attracted a steady stream of warriors from across Central Asia and the wider Turkic world, adventurers, religious volunteers, and mercenaries drawn by the promise of both plunder and paradise, swelling the ranks of what had begun as a tiny local following into a genuine fighting force capable of sustained territorial expansion. Byzantine authorities made the fatal mistake of underestimating this growing threat for decades, viewing Osman's band as simply one more minor nuisance among the constant background noise of frontier raiding that had characterized this contested borderland for generations. That underestimation proved catastrophic. By the time Byzantine leadership recognized the seriousness of what was unfolding along their eastern frontier, Osman's forces and his immediate successors had already captured the significant city of Bursa, transforming it into the first capital of what would formally become the Ottoman dynasty, a name derived from Osman's own. The military innovations pioneered during these early decades set the fledgling state apart from its European contemporaries in a way that would prove decisive over the following centuries. While medieval Europe remained deeply invested in mounted knights and feudal levies as its primary military model, the early Ottomans began developing something unusual for the era: standing infantry forces maintained on a more permanent, professional basis, rather than assembled temporarily for individual campaigns, and disbanded afterward. The Ottomans achieved their first crossing into the European continent in 1354, seizing the strategic peninsula of Gallipoli after a fortuitous earthquake shattered the fortifications defending the crossing point. What began as an opportunistic exploitation of natural disaster would prove to be one of history's great turning points, planting Ottoman forces permanently on European soil for the very first time and opening a pathway into the Balkans that this rising power would exploit relentlessly over the following decades. The specific geographic and political circumstances that allowed Osman's small principality to survive its vulnerable early decades deserve particular attention, since so many comparable frontier warbands throughout Anatolian history simply failed to survive long enough to matter. Positioned along the very edge of the fragmenting Seljuk Turkish Sultanate that had previously dominated much of Anatolia, and simultaneously bordering weakened Byzantine territory, offering attractive opportunities for both raiding and eventual conquest, Osman's principality occupied a genuinely fortunate strategic position, close enough to profitable targets to sustain itself through plunder and gradual territorial absorption, yet distant enough from any single overwhelmingly powerful regional rival to avoid early destruction before it had the chance to consolidate genuine strength. The tribal warband that Osman commanded in those earliest years bore little resemblance to the sophisticated imperial bureaucracy his descendants would eventually construct. Contemporary accounts describe a loosely organized confederation of horsemen and foot soldiers, bound together as much by shared opportunity and religious purpose as by any formal chain of command, operating in a manner not dramatically different from dozens of similar frontier warbands scattered across Anatolia during this chaotic period. What distinguished Osman's followers from their many rivals was not initial size or resources, but a combination of favorable geography. Positioned close enough to weakened Byzantine territory to raid profitably, yet far enough from any single dominant regional power to avoid early destruction, and a series of capable successive leaders who proved consistently better than their neighbors at converting battlefield success into durable, lasting territorial control rather than simply plunder and retreat. As Ottoman territory expanded deeper into the Balkans, the empire's rulers developed one of the most unusual and controversial institutions in military history, the devshirme system, commonly translated as the blood tax. Every 3 to 5 years, Ottoman officials would descend on Christian villages throughout the conquered Balkan territories, systematically selecting boys between roughly 8 and 18 years old from local families and forcibly removing them from their homes, their communities, and their religious identity forever. These captured boys underwent a deliberate, comprehensive transformation. Converted to Islam, stripped of any connection to their birth families, and subjected to rigorous training combining military discipline with religious and administrative education, they emerged from this process as something entirely new, soldiers whose only loyalty, only family, and only identity centered on the Ottoman Sultan personally. The system was engineered specifically to eliminate the tribal and familial loyalties that had traditionally made regional warlords and hereditary nobility such persistent threats to centralized royal authority throughout the medieval world. From this system emerged the Janissaries, widely recognized as the first standing professional infantry force in the world, soldiers who trained year-round, rather than only during campaign season, who lived under strict military discipline, and who were, for centuries, forbidden from marrying or pursuing any occupation outside their military service. This total dedication produced a fighting force of extraordinary discipline and battlefield reliability that gave the Ottomans a significant tactical advantage over rivals still relying on more traditional, less consistently trained feudal levies. The system produced a genuinely strange contradiction that fascinated contemporary observers across the Islamic and Christian worlds alike. These captured Christian boys, taken by force from their families, often rose to become the empire's most powerful and privileged figures. Many devshirme-trained officials climbed to the very highest ranks of Ottoman government, including the position of Grand Vizier, effectively the empire's chief minister, second in authority only to the Sultan himself, meaning that some of the most influential decision-makers shaping Ottoman policy had begun life as enslaved Christian children from Balkan villages. Ottoman military expansion into the Balkans reached a decisive milestone at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where Ottoman forces crushed the Serbian kingdom's army in a battle that would become deeply embedded in Serbian national memory and mythology for the following 6 centuries. In the immediate aftermath of this victory, Sultan Murad I was assassinated in his own camp by a Serbian nobleman who had infiltrated Ottoman lines, triggering swift and brutal reprisal against the defeated Serbian forces. His successor, Bayezid I, earned the nickname the Thunderbolt for the extraordinary speed of his military campaigns, striking with such rapid, unpredictable force that enemies rarely had time to organize effective coordinated resistance before his armies had already achieved their objectives. Yet this same aggressive, overconfident momentum led Bayezid into catastrophic disaster in 1402, when his forces met the army of the Central Asian conqueror Tamerlane at the Battle of Ankara. The Ottoman Sultan suffered a devastating, humiliating defeat and was captured alive, reportedly held in captivity until his death not long afterward, a stunning reversal of fortune for an empire that had, until that moment, seemed unstoppable. The Devshirme system's psychological engineering deserves particular attention because it represented a genuinely sophisticated understanding of how to build institutional loyalty from scratch, centuries before modern organizational theory would formally articulate similar principles. By deliberately severing recruits from every prior source of identity and belonging, family, homeland, native religion, native language in many cases, Ottoman administrators created soldiers whose entire sense of self became inseparable from their new identity as servants of the Sultan. This was not simply conversion or training. It was total psychological reconstruction, conducted systematically on children too young to meaningfully resist, producing adults for whom loyalty to the Ottoman state was not merely a duty, but the very foundation of their personal identity, having effectively no other life or belonging to which they could return. Recruitment quotas and selection criteria for the Devshirme system varied considerably across different regions and time periods, but surviving Ottoman administrative records reveal a surprisingly methodical bureaucratic process behind what might otherwise seem like simple, chaotic child abduction. Officials typically sought boys displaying particular physical fitness, intelligence, and aptitude, with the most promising candidates channeled toward palace service and eventual high administrative positions, while others received more purely military training, destined for service within the Janissary ranks themselves. Some historical accounts even suggest that certain Balkan Christian families, recognizing the genuine social and economic mobility available to successful Devshirme recruits within Ottoman society, occasionally sought to have their own sons selected for this program, a striking illustration of just how thoroughly the system's promise of advancement could, in certain circumstances, complicate the straightforwardly tragic narrative of forced child conscription that dominates most popular historical memory of the practice. Bayezid's catastrophic defeat and capture plunged the young Ottoman state into 11 years of devastating internal chaos. With no clear, unchallenged successor to the throne, 4 of Bayezid's sons descended into open civil war against one another, each commanding their own regional power base and their own coalition of supporters, tearing apart in a decade what previous generations had spent a century building. Eventually, one son, Mehmed I, emerged victorious from this brutal fraternal struggle, managing to reunify the fractured Ottoman territories under his own authority. But the lesson of this civil war, that succession disputes between multiple legitimate royal claimants could bring an entire empire to the brink of total collapse, left a permanent, formative impression on subsequent generations of Ottoman rulers who had witnessed firsthand just how close their family's ambitious project had come to complete destruction. That lesson found its ultimate brutal expression under Mehmed II, who formally codified what would become known as the law of fratricide. The principle was stated with chilling directness. For the sake of the order of the world, whichever of the Sultan's sons inherited the throne possessed the legal right and religious sanction to have his brothers executed, eliminating in advance any possibility of the kind of ruinous succession war that had so nearly destroyed the empire a generation earlier. The method prescribed for these executions carried its own grim logic, rooted in religious sensibility. Direct bloodshed against royal blood was considered a serious taboo, so the preferred method became strangulation, using a silk bowstring, a technique that killed without spilling blood onto the ground, a distinction that mattered enormously within the era's particular framework of honor and religious propriety, even as the underlying act remained the calculated murder of children, brothers, and infants by order of the state. The psychological weight this law placed on every generation of the Ottoman royal family is difficult to fully comprehend from a modern vantage point. Every young prince grew up understanding, with complete clarity, that the day his father died would become the day he either killed his own brothers or was killed by them. There existed no peaceful, negotiated alternative built into the system whatsoever. Childhood within the Ottoman dynasty meant growing up alongside siblings you might one day be legally obligated to have executed, or who might one day order your own execution the moment they secured the throne. Historians examining this brutal institution across the roughly 2 centuries it remained active generally acknowledge an uncomfortable truth, however morally horrifying by any reasonable modern standard. The law of fratricide functioned with remarkable effectiveness in preventing the kind of prolonged, empire-fracturing succession wars that plagued so many other dynasties and states throughout history. The Ottomans essentially traded basic humanitarian considerations for 2 centuries of comparatively smoother, more predictable dynastic transitions. A brutal, calculated bargain between political stability and human life that few other states in history have been willing to formalize so explicitly into actual law. Mehmed II's own justification for codifying this practice, preserved in surviving Ottoman legal texts, reveals a chillingly rational political calculation rather than mere cruelty for its own sake. The law explicitly framed fratricide as a necessary evil undertaken for the greater good of preserving order across the entire empire, reasoning that the deaths of a handful of princes represented a far smaller cost than the widespread suffering, economic devastation, and loss of life that a prolonged multi-year civil war between rival claimants would inevitably inflict on millions of ordinary subjects. Whether or not one accepts this utilitarian logic, it reflects a state apparatus willing to formalize almost unimaginable brutality into explicit legal doctrine, reasoning through consequences with a coldness that later Ottoman rulers themselves would eventually find morally unsustainable, even as they struggled for decades to devise a workable alternative. The 11-year interregnum that preceded this legal codification left scars on Ottoman institutional memory that extended well beyond the specific policy response of formalized fratricide. Regional governors and military commanders who had been forced to choose sides among the competing royal claimants during those chaotic years learned firsthand just how quickly local loyalty could shift when the central authority itself became genuinely contested, a lesson that shaped Ottoman administrative philosophy toward heavy centralization and limited independent regional authority for generations afterward. The empire that emerged from this crisis was, in a real sense, more centralized and more focused on preventing any repeat of internal fragmentation than it might otherwise have become, a defensive institutional posture directly traceable to the trauma of watching the young state nearly tear itself apart from within during those 11 brutal years of civil war. By the middle of the 15th century, one prize remained tantalizingly beyond Ottoman reach: Constantinople itself, the ancient capital that had stood as the seat of Roman imperial power in its Byzantine form for over 1,000 years, surviving siege after siege that had claimed countless other great cities throughout that same span of time. In 1451, A young and fiercely ambitious sultan named Mehmed II, only 21 years old at his accession, set his sights on achieving what generations of his predecessors had attempted and failed to accomplish. Constantinople's extraordinary resilience owed much to its legendary Theodosian walls, a triple-layered defensive fortification system that had turned back invading armies for over a millennium, widely regarded throughout the medieval world as among the most formidable defensive structures ever constructed by human engineering. Any serious attempt to take the city required solving the seemingly impossible problem these ancient walls represented. Mehmed found his solution in a Hungarian cannon founder named Urban, who had originally offered his revolutionary siege weapon designs to the Byzantine emperor first, only to be turned away due to lack of funds. Mehmed, by contrast, offered Urban virtually unlimited resources, and the result was a weapon of unprecedented scale, an enormous bombard capable of firing stone projectiles weighing roughly 600 kilograms across distances exceeding a mile, a cannon so massive it required specialized transport and dozens of oxen simply to move it into position outside the city walls. Beyond raw firepower, Mehmed demonstrated remarkable tactical creativity throughout the siege. When the Byzantine defenders sealed off the strategically vital Golden Horn waterway using a massive iron chain, blocking any naval approach into that section of the city, Mehmed responded with an audacious solution. He ordered his forces to construct a greased wooden track over land, and, under cover of darkness, physically hauled entire warships overland across hills to bypass the chain entirely, launching them directly into the previously protected waterway. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of relentless bombardment and multiple failed assaults, Ottoman forces launched their final, decisive attack. Elite Janissary units spearheaded the breakthrough, finally overwhelming exhausted Byzantine defenders who had held the walls far longer than almost anyone believed possible. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly died fighting in the chaos of the final defense, his body never definitively identified afterward, bringing a symbolic and literal end to the unbroken line of Roman emperors that stretched back over 14 centuries. In the aftermath, Mehmed ordered the magnificent Hagia Sophia, for nearly 1,000 years the greatest cathedral in Christendom, converted into a mosque, a transformation that sent genuine shockwaves of horror and grief through Christian Europe, cementing Mehmed's reputation among Western observers as an almost apocalyptic figure. Beyond the immediate religious and symbolic devastation, the fall of Constantinople carried enormous long-term economic consequences. European access to established overland trade routes toward Asia became increasingly restricted under Ottoman control, a disruption that historians widely credit as one of the key motivating factors driving European maritime powers to seek entirely new sea routes to Asia, a search that would eventually lead directly to the European discovery of the Americas. The siege itself lasted 53 grueling days, during which the vastly outnumbered Byzantine defenders, reinforced by a small contingent of Genoese volunteers under the command of a soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani, repeatedly repelled Ottoman assaults through sheer determination and skillful use of the city's ancient defensive architecture. Mehmed's own advisors reportedly grew increasingly anxious as the siege dragged on without decisive success, some urging the young sultan to abandon the campaign entirely, rather than risk the embarrassment of failure against a city so many previous conquerors had also failed to take. Mehmed's refusal to accept anything short of total victory, combined with his willingness to pursue unconventional tactical solutions like the overland ship transport, ultimately proved decisive in breaking what had appeared to be an unbreakable stalemate. The fall of Constantinople also triggered a significant exodus of Byzantine scholars and intellectuals fleeing westward into Italy and other parts of Western Europe, carrying with them ancient Greek manuscripts and classical scholarship that had been preserved within Byzantine libraries for centuries. Many historians identify this scholarly migration as a meaningful contributing factor to the broader intellectual flowering of the Italian Renaissance, already underway during this period, meaning that the same military catastrophe that extinguished the last vestige of the Roman Empire simultaneously helped fuel a renewed European engagement with classical learning that would reshape European art, science and philosophy for centuries to come. One of history's more striking examples of how a single dramatic military event can generate consequences reaching far beyond its immediate political and territorial impact. The 16th century marked the undisputed golden age of Ottoman power, reaching its fullest expression under Sultan Suleiman, remembered by history with the title the Magnificent for the extraordinary scope of his legal reforms, cultural patronage, and military conquests that together represented the empire operating at the absolute peak of its combined political, legal, and martial capabilities. Suleiman's early military campaigns delivered a rapid series of stunning victories. In 1522, his forces successfully conquered the island stronghold of Rhodes, driving out the Knights Hospitaller who had used the island as a base for launching raids against Ottoman shipping for generations. 4 years later, at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Ottoman forces achieved one of the most lopsided and consequential victories of the entire era, annihilating the Hungarian royal army so completely and so quickly that the battle lasted barely 2 hours before the Hungarian king lay dead and his kingdom's military capacity had been effectively erased. Emboldened by this string of triumphs, Suleiman set his ambitions on an even greater prize, Vienna itself, gateway to the heart of Central Europe. His 1529 siege of the Austrian capital sent genuine waves of panic rippling through European capitals far beyond the immediate battlefield, as observers across the continent contemplated the very real possibility of Ottoman forces pushing deep into the European heartland. Ultimately, the siege failed, undone in large part by logistical realities rather than battlefield defeat. Early, unusually heavy winter weather turned the roads to thick, impassable mud, preventing Suleiman's heaviest siege artillery from ever reaching the city walls in time to make a decisive difference. Suleiman's foreign policy also produced one of the era's more controversial diplomatic arrangements, a formal alliance between the Muslim Ottoman Empire and Catholic France, both parties united by their shared interest in checking the growing power of the rival Habsburg dynasty that dominated much of Central Europe and Spain. This pragmatic partnership scandalized much of contemporary European Christian opinion, which struggled to reconcile the notion of Christian France allying openly with the era's most feared Islamic power against fellow Christian rivals. Yet, for all his genuine political and military brilliance, Suleiman's personal life contained a devastating flaw that would echo forward through Ottoman history. Persuaded by the manipulative influence of his powerful wife, Hürrem Sultan, Suleiman ultimately ordered the execution of his own son and heir apparent, Mustafa, a prince widely regarded by contemporaries as exceptionally capable and popular among both the military and the general population, a decision driven by court intrigue and jealous maneuvering rather than any genuine threat Mustafa actually posed, and one that many historians view as a critical turning point, contributing to the gradual decline in succession quality that would plague the empire in the generations following Suleiman's own remarkable reign. Beyond his military conquests, Suleiman earned his title the lawgiver within his own empire through a comprehensive overhaul of Ottoman legal codes, harmonizing secular administrative law with religious Islamic law into a unified, coherent system that governed the empire's diverse territories and populations with a degree of consistency rarely achieved by contemporary European states, still grappling with fragmented feudal legal traditions. His reign also witnessed extraordinary architectural and cultural achievement, most visibly embodied in the work of the master architect Mimar Sinan, whose mosques, bridges, and public buildings across the empire represented some of the finest engineering and artistic achievements of the 16th century world. Physical testament to an empire operating simultaneously as a formidable military power and a genuine center of cultural and intellectual sophistication. Suleiman's extended military campaigns also stretched deep into the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, where Ottoman naval forces engaged in a lesser-known but strategically significant series of conflicts against Portuguese colonial power for control over lucrative maritime spice trade routes connecting Europe to South Asia. Though ultimately unable to fully dislodge Portuguese dominance over these distant waters, these campaigns demonstrated the genuinely global scope of Ottoman ambition during this golden age, a reach extending simultaneously from the gates of Vienna in Central Europe to the shores of the Indian Ocean, reflecting an imperial capacity for sustained, coordinated military and naval projection across multiple, widely separated theatres that few, if any, contemporary states anywhere in the world could realistically match during this particular period of Ottoman history. Ottoman naval power during this golden age extended Ottoman influence across the entire Mediterranean basin, enforced in significant part through alliances with notorious corsairs, pirate commanders like the famous Barbarossa brothers, who operated under nominal Ottoman authority while conducting devastating raids against European coastal shipping and settlements throughout the region. These corsair operations fueled a massive and brutal human trafficking system historians call the Barbary slave trade, through which an estimated 1 million or more European captives, seized from coastal raids and captured ships spanning centuries, were forced into slavery across North African Ottoman territories, a systematic human cost that receives far less popular historical attention than it perhaps deserves given its sheer scale and duration. Tensions between Ottoman naval power and the Christian states of the Mediterranean reached a decisive breaking point over control of the island of Cyprus, where Ottoman forces besieged the fortress city of Famagusta and, following its eventual surrender, subjected the defeated Venetian commander to a horrifically brutal execution, an act of calculated cruelty that shocked and enraged European opinion and helped galvanize previously fractured Christian states into unified action. Pope Pius V successfully organized the Holy League, a coalition combining naval forces from Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and several smaller Italian territories into a single unified fleet capable of directly confronting Ottoman naval supremacy in the Mediterranean for the first time in generations. The resulting confrontation at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 stands as the largest galley battle in recorded history, an enormous clash involving hundreds of oar-powered warships crammed with soldiers and sailors, fought at close quarters in a chaotic, bloody engagement that transformed sections of the Mediterranean into what contemporary accounts vividly described as literally running red with blood. The battle ended in a decisive Ottoman defeat, and the human cost proved particularly devastating in ways that extended well beyond the immediate battlefield casualties. The Ottoman navy lost not merely ships but tens of thousands of highly trained naval archers and experienced sailors, specialized personnel whose years of accumulated skill and training could not simply be replaced through hasty recruitment, representing a genuine, lasting depletion of irreplaceable military expertise that weakened Ottoman naval capability for years to come. Yet in a striking demonstration of the empire's continued underlying economic strength during this period, Ottoman shipyards managed to construct an entirely new fleet within roughly a single year following the catastrophic defeat at Lepanto, a remarkable feat of industrial and administrative capacity that stunned European observers and illustrated just how vast the empire's material resources genuinely remained, even in the immediate aftermath of one of the most significant naval defeats in its entire history. Contemporary Venetian and Spanish accounts of Lepanto describe scenes of almost unimaginable carnage, with survivors recalling the sea itself thick with wreckage, bodies, and blood across a battlefield that stretched for miles along the Gulf of Corinth. Among the wounded fighting on the Christian side that day was a young Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes, who would later lose the use of his left hand from injuries sustained in the battle before going on to write Don Quixote, one of the most influential novels in world literature, a small but striking illustration of how deeply this single, brutal naval engagement rippled outward into the broader cultural and historical fabric of the era. touching lives and legacies far beyond the immediate military and political consequences most historians typically emphasize. The strategic aftermath of Lepanto also illustrates an important, often overlooked truth about the actual balance of power between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe during this period. Despite the symbolic magnitude of the Holy League's victory, celebrated across Europe with genuine jubilation as proof that Ottoman naval supremacy could finally be broken, the practical territorial consequences of the battle proved remarkably limited. Ottoman forces retained control of Cyprus, the very island whose contested status had triggered the conflict in the first place, and continued exercising substantial influence across much of the eastern Mediterranean for generations afterward. A sobering reminder that even a decisive tactical battlefield victory does not automatically translate into lasting strategic transformation when the underlying balance of overall imperial resources and capability remains fundamentally unchanged. By the early 17th century, Ottoman rulers finally began confronting the sheer moral and political cost of the fratricide law that had governed royal succession for nearly 2 centuries. Growing discomfort with the institutionalized murder of children and infants, combined with the practical waste of eliminating potentially capable heirs before they ever had the chance to demonstrate their abilities, led to the law's gradual abandonment in favor of an alternative system that proved, in its own way, almost equally destructive to the long-term health of Ottoman governance. This replacement system became known as the cafes, or the cage. Rather than executing royal brothers outright, they were instead confined for life within isolated, heavily guarded chambers of the royal palace, cut off almost entirely from outside contact, political education, or any meaningful preparation for eventual rule, effectively imprisoned within luxury for the potential remainder of their natural lives. The consequences of this system proved genuinely catastrophic for the quality of subsequent Ottoman leadership. Princes who spent decades confined within the cage, sometimes emerging only in their 30s or 40s, following the unexpected death of a ruling brother, frequently arrived on the throne, having developed serious psychological difficulties from their prolonged isolation. Entirely lacking any practical experience in military command, diplomatic negotiation, or the countless daily responsibilities of effective governance. A systemic failure that produced a troubling succession of poorly prepared, sometimes genuinely unstable sultans during this critical period. With rulers increasingly incapable of exercising effective personal authority, genuine political power shifted decisively into the hands of powerful women within the royal harem, an extended period historians have come to call the Sultanate of Women, during which queen mothers and influential consorts effectively directed imperial policy from behind the scenes, while weak, isolated sultans occupied the throne largely in name only. Compounding this crisis of leadership was the increasingly troubling transformation of the once elite Janissary corps. Originally created as an unmarried, purely military caste with total dedication to the Sultan's service, Janissaries gradually secured the right to marry, pursue outside business interests, and pass their privileged status down to their own sons, transforming what had once been history's premier professional fighting force into something closer to a hereditary, self-interested political and economic faction, one that grew bold enough to depose and occasionally execute sultans whose policies threatened their accumulated privileges and interests, effectively holding the imperial throne hostage to their own institutional self-preservation rather than serving the empire's broader strategic needs. The physical conditions within the cage itself deserve closer examination, since they help explain the severe psychological toll this system inflicted on its royal inhabitants. Princes confined within these chambers typically lived under constant guard, permitted only limited, carefully monitored interaction with a small circle of servants and concubines, denied access to education in statecraft, military affairs, or even basic current events from the outside world. Some accounts describe princes who had spent decades in this isolated confinement, emerging with severe difficulty adjusting to ordinary social interaction, let alone the immense practical demands of ruling a sprawling multi-continental empire, a tragic human cost, embedded directly within a system originally designed, however imperfectly, as a supposedly more humane alternative to the outright fratricide it had replaced. The Sultanate of Women period, though often dismissed dismissively in older historical narratives as simply a symptom of imperial decline, has undergone significant scholarly re-evaluation in recent decades, with many historians now recognizing the genuine political sophistication and administrative competence displayed by figures like Kösem Sultan and other powerful royal women who effectively governed the empire during this era of weak, isolated sultans. Rather than representing simple corruption or illegitimate usurpation of proper authority, these women frequently proved themselves highly capable administrators, skillfully managing court factions, foreign diplomatic relations, and internal succession disputes during a genuinely difficult period when the formal male leadership structure had become largely dysfunctional, ensuring the empire's continued basic functioning even as its nominal rulers proved increasingly incapable of exercising effective personal command. The gradual transformation of the Janissary corps from an unmarried, purely military caste into something resembling a hereditary guild pursuing outside commercial interests reflected a broader institutional drift that Ottoman central authority struggled for decades to reverse. Once Janissaries secured the right to marry and pass their status to their own sons, family and economic interests inevitably began competing with, and frequently overriding, pure military duty and discipline as the primary motivating force shaping individual soldiers' behavior and loyalty. This slow institutional decay, unfolding gradually across generations rather than through any single dramatic moment of corruption, illustrates how even history's most rigorously designed and initially disciplined institutions can drift substantially from their founding purpose when the underlying incentive structures shift, even incrementally, over sufficiently long periods of sustained institutional continuity. By the late 17th century, one final ambitious attempt to fundamentally expand Ottoman territory deeper into Europe emerged under the leadership of an aggressive Grand Vizier named Kara Mustafa Pasha, who convinced the reigning sultan to authorize a massive military campaign aimed once again at capturing Vienna, the same strategic prize that had eluded Suleiman more than a century and a half earlier. An enormous Ottoman force, numbering well over 200,000 soldiers by most historical estimates, surrounded the Austrian capital in the summer of 1683, initiating a siege that would stretch on for roughly 2 grueling months. Ottoman engineers pursued a methodical strategy of undermining the city's defences through extensive tunnel networks packed with explosive charges, gradually eroding Vienna's fortifications and pushing the city's exhausted, starving defenders to the very brink of complete collapse. Salvation arrived on September 12, 1683, in the form of a relief army led by the Polish king, Jan III Sobieski, who had assembled a coalition force from multiple Central European states, specifically to break the siege before Vienna's inevitable fall. The battle's decisive moment came through a massive cavalry charge conducted by the legendary Winged Hussars, elite Polish heavy cavalry famous for the distinctive feathered wings mounted on their armour, who launched what remains, by many historical assessments, the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, smashing directly through Ottoman lines and shattering the besieging army's cohesion within hours. The Ottoman retreat that followed was chaotic and hasty, abandoned so quickly that fleeing forces left behind enormous quantities of military equipment, supplies, and provisions, including, according to popular historical legend, substantial stores of coffee that Viennese citizens subsequently discovered and adopted, contributing directly to the later emergence of Vienna's famous coffeehouse culture that continues to this day. Kara Mustafa Pasha paid the ultimate price for this catastrophic failure, executed by strangulation on direct orders from the Sultan, as formal accountability for the disastrous campaign's outcome. More significantly, the defeat at Vienna marked a genuine, permanent turning point in the centuries-long balance of power between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe. From this moment forward, the Ottomans would never again seriously threaten to expand deeper into the European heartland, and the long, gradual process of Ottoman territorial retreat and relative decline had unmistakably begun. The scale of Vienna's near collapse before Sobieski's arrival is difficult to overstate. Contemporary accounts describe a city reduced to its final reserves of food and gunpowder, its defensive walls breached in multiple locations by Ottoman mining operations, with defenders reportedly down to their absolute last lines of resistance in the days immediately preceding the relief forces' arrival. Had Sobieski's coalition army arrived even a few days later, or failed to break through Ottoman lines as decisively as it ultimately did, historians widely agree that Vienna would very likely have fallen, an outcome that could have fundamentally altered the subsequent political and religious trajectory of Central Europe in ways impossible to fully predict, underscoring just how genuinely close this pivotal battle came to producing an entirely different outcome for European history. Kara Mustafa Pasha's fatal miscalculation extended beyond simple military overreach into a broader failure of coalition diplomacy that ultimately doomed his ambitious campaign. His aggressive posture and evident territorial ambitions helped galvanize what had previously been a fragmented and often mutually hostile collection of Central European states into unprecedented, if temporary, cooperation, uniting Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, and various German principalities behind a shared recognition that Ottoman expansion represented a genuine existential threat requiring immediate, coordinated response rather than the usual pattern of individual states pursuing their own separate, often conflicting regional interests. An unintended diplomatic consequence of Ottoman aggression that arguably did more lasting damage to long-term Ottoman strategic interests than the immediate military defeat itself. In the years immediately following the failed siege, the newly unified Christian coalition that had formed to relieve Vienna continued pressing its advantage, launching a sustained counteroffensive that would eventually recapture substantial territories the Ottomans had held in Hungary and the surrounding Balkan region for well over a century. This sustained territorial reversal, formalized through the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, represented the first time in Ottoman imperial history that the empire had been forced to formally cede substantial previously conquered territory back to a European rival, through negotiated treaty rather, than simply losing individual battles while retaining overall strategic initiative. A genuinely unprecedented reversal that signaled, in the clearest possible diplomatic terms, that the long era of unchecked Ottoman territorial expansion into Europe had now decisively and permanently ended. Beginning in the 16th century and accelerating through subsequent generations, a global economic transformation began quietly undermining Ottoman financial stability in ways few contemporaries fully understood at the time. Massive quantities of silver flowing into European markets from Spanish colonial mining operations in the Americas triggered severe currency devaluation and inflation that rippled outward across the entire connected Mediterranean and Middle Eastern economic system, including Ottoman territories that had long relied on relatively stable currency values to sustain effective governance and taxation. Compounding this monetary crisis, European maritime powers increasingly bypassed traditional overland trade routes through Ottoman territory entirely, instead developing direct oceanic shipping routes to Asian markets that eliminated the transit taxes and tariffs Ottoman authorities had historically collected on goods moving between Europe and the East, a fundamental restructuring of global commerce that steadily eroded one of the empire's most reliable historical sources of revenue. Perhaps most consequentially, the Janissary Corps that had once represented history's most formidable professional military institution increasingly resisted the very technological and tactical modernization that might have preserved their battlefield effectiveness against evolving European military capabilities. Deeply entrenched in their accumulated privileges and traditional methods, Janissary units frequently refused to adopt updated firearms technology or embrace the systematic European-style training reforms that rival powers were rapidly implementing, leaving what had once been an unmatched fighting force increasingly outdated and outmatched on the modern battlefield. Meanwhile, a formidable new rival emerged along the empire's northern frontier, the Russian Empire, transformed under the ambitious leadership of Peter the Great, and later Catherine the Great, into a genuinely modern military and naval power, specifically oriented toward expansion at direct Ottoman expense. A punishing series of Russo-Turkish wars across the following decades progressively stripped away Ottoman territory, most significantly, the loss of Crimea and effective Ottoman control over the strategically vital Black Sea region. By the 19th century, the empire's decline had become so unmistakable and so widely recognized across European diplomatic circles that it earned the enduring, unflattering nickname, the sick man of Europe, propped up in significant part not through any genuine internal recovery, but because rival powers like Britain and France calculated that a weakened but intact Ottoman state served their own strategic interests better than allowing Russia to seize Ottoman territory and access unrestricted, warm-water naval routes through the Black Sea Straits. Simultaneously, powerful nationalist movements began erupting across Ottoman-controlled Balkan territories, as Greek, Serbian, and Romanian populations increasingly organized and fought for full independence from centuries of Ottoman rule. The Janissary Corps' resistance to reform reflected deep structural incentives rather than simple stubbornness or short-sightedness. Modernizing military training and equipment would have required substantially altering a system of privileges, exemptions, and hereditary status that generations of Janissary families had come to depend upon as their primary source of income and social standing, making genuine reform a direct existential threat to their accumulated interests rather than a straightforward technical upgrade any rational actor should have welcomed. This same dynamic, entrenched institutional interests actively blocking necessary modernization precisely because reform threatened their accumulated privileges, would recur repeatedly throughout the empire's long, difficult attempts at internal reform during its final 2 centuries. A structural pattern of institutional self-interest overriding genuine strategic necessity that historians studying imperial decline across many different civilizations have identified as a remarkably common feature of aging, once dominant powers struggling to adapt to changing circumstances. The early Ottoman rulers who succeeded Osman also demonstrated a shrewd, pragmatic approach to governing the diverse populations they conquered, an administrative flexibility that helped explain their sustained success where many contemporary conquering powers ultimately failed to hold their gains. Rather than imposing forced conversion or wholesale destruction on conquered Christian populations in the Balkans, early Ottoman administration generally permitted continued religious practice in exchange for payment of a specific tax and acceptance of Ottoman political authority, a relatively pragmatic arrangement that, compared to the harsher alternatives available at the time, made Ottoman rule genuinely tolerable and in some documented cases even preferable to the often more oppressive feudal arrangements many Balkan peasant populations had previously endured under their own local Christian nobility. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II took a dramatic, calculated gamble to finally break the destabilizing grip the Janissary Corps had held over Ottoman governance for generations. In an event that came to be known, with grim historical irony, as the auspicious incident, Mahmud used modern artillery to bombard the Janissary barracks directly, slaughtering thousands of the once elite soldiers in a single, ruthlessly efficient massacre that permanently eliminated the institution's centuries-long stranglehold over Ottoman military and political affairs. With this obstacle finally removed, Mahmud initiated a sweeping program of structural reform known as the Tanzimat, a systematic effort to modernize Ottoman law, administration, education, and military organization along broadly European lines. Even outward appearance became a deliberate symbol of this reform agenda, as traditional dress gave way to European-influenced styles, including the distinctive fez headwear that would come to define Ottoman official appearance for the following century. Ottoman military forces achieved a notable moment of renewed relevance during the Crimean War of the 1850s, fighting alongside British and French allies against Russia in a conflict that temporarily halted Russian expansion at Ottoman expense. Yet this apparent military success came at a devastating long-term financial cost. Unable to sustain wartime military spending through traditional domestic revenue sources, the Ottoman government was forced, for the very first time in its history, to borrow substantial sums directly from European financial markets. This initial foreign borrowing rapidly spiraled into a genuine debt trap, from which the empire never fully recovered. By 1875, accumulated foreign debt had grown so overwhelming that the Ottoman government formally defaulted, triggering the establishment of direct European financial oversight over Ottoman tax collection and government revenue, a humiliating arrangement that effectively placed core functions of Ottoman state sovereignty under the direct administrative control of the very European powers the empire had once dominated militarily. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who took power in 1876, briefly experimented with constitutional governance before quickly abandoning the experiment in favor of increasingly authoritarian personal rule, maintaining his grip on power through an extensive secret police and surveillance network, reportedly employing tens of thousands of informants monitoring the population for any signs of dissent or opposition. It was precisely this atmosphere of stifling authoritarian control, combined with the empire's undeniable ongoing military and economic decline, that gave rise to a new generation of educated young military officers and intellectuals increasingly convinced that only radical, revolutionary change could possibly save the crumbling empire from complete collapse, a movement history would come to know as the Young Turks. The auspicious incident of 1826, for all its calculated brutality, represented a genuine turning point that finally freed subsequent Ottoman rulers to pursue meaningful military and administrative modernization without facing the constant threat of Janissary-led palace coups that had constrained reform efforts for generations. Muhammad II's willingness to use overwhelming decisive force against an institution that had once represented the very foundation of Ottoman military power illustrated both the depth of the crisis facing the empire and the ruthless pragmatism still available to a sufficiently determined ruler, even as the broader trajectory of relative Ottoman decline, compared to rapidly industrializing European rivals, continued largely unabated despite these genuine, hard-won internal reforms. The Tanzimat reform era's mixed legacy reflects a broader pattern common to many aging empires attempting comprehensive modernization under severe external pressure and constrained internal resources. Legal and educational reforms genuinely modernized significant portions of Ottoman civil administration, creating secular courts, expanding modern secular education alongside traditional religious schooling, and establishing more standardized, professionalized government bureaucracy along broadly European institutional lines. Yet these reforms consistently struggled against entrenched conservative religious and military opposition, chronic budget shortfalls that limited full implementation across the empire's vast and diverse territories, and the sheer scale of the gap that had opened between Ottoman institutional capacity and the rapidly industrializing military and economic power of leading European states, ensuring that even genuinely well-designed reforms frequently arrived too late, or were implemented too incompletely, to fundamentally reverse the empire's underlying relative decline on the world stage. In 1908, this movement of reform-minded young officers and intellectuals successfully forced Sultan Abdul Hamid II to restore the constitutional government he had suspended decades earlier, a genuine revolutionary achievement that briefly promised a new, more modern, and representative direction for the aging empire's continued survival. That promise was quickly overshadowed by catastrophic territorial losses during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, conflicts in which a coalition of newly independent Balkan states inflicted devastating military defeats on Ottoman forces, stripping away vast stretches of remaining European territory and triggering a massive humanitarian crisis, as hundreds of thousands of displaced Turkish and Muslim refugees flooded into Istanbul, overwhelming the capital's resources and further destabilizing an already fragile political situation. From the chaos and recrimination surrounding these humiliating defeats emerged a triumvirate of ambitious young officers who effectively seized total control of Ottoman governance. Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, collectively remembered by history as the Three Pashas, a genuinely authoritarian ruling clique that increasingly bypassed formal constitutional government in favor of direct personal control over Ottoman military and foreign policy. When the First World War erupted across Europe in August 1914, the Ottoman Empire initially possessed a genuine, viable option to remain neutral, avoiding direct involvement in a conflict that risked catastrophic consequences for an already weakened state. Enver Pasha, however, harbored deep personal admiration for German military capability and organization, convinced that aligning with what he believed would be the war's ultimate victor, offered the best available path toward reversing decades of humiliating Ottoman territorial and political decline. Acting largely on his own initiative, and in direct contradiction of the more cautious positions held by other members of the Ottoman cabinet, Enver secretly negotiated and signed a formal military alliance with Imperial Germany, an agreement finalized in almost complete secrecy from most of the wider Ottoman government, and reportedly unknown even to the Sultan himself at the moment of signing. The war-triggering incident that followed possessed an almost theatrical quality. Two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, evaded pursuing British naval forces in the Mediterranean and sought refuge in Ottoman territorial waters. Rather than interning these vessels as neutrality would technically have required, Ottoman authorities allowed the ships to be nominally transferred to Ottoman ownership while retaining their German crews, who then promptly sailed into the Black Sea and launched surprise artillery attacks against Russian ports, an unmistakable act of war that effectively dragged the entire Ottoman Empire into the First World War through what amounted to a calculated deception orchestrated by a small circle of pro-German officials rather than any genuine national consensus or formal declaration process. In a final attempt to rally broader Islamic support for the war effort, the Sultan issued a formal declaration of jihad against Britain, France, and Russia, calling on Muslims worldwide to rise up against these colonial powers. The appeal largely fell flat, as Muslim populations across British, French, and Russian colonial territories overwhelmingly failed to respond to a call that most recognized as transparently serving Ottoman and German strategic interests, rather than any genuine shared religious cause. The secrecy surrounding Enver Pasha's alliance negotiations reveals a great deal about how thoroughly personal ambition and ideological conviction had overridden normal governmental process within the late Ottoman state. Rather than presenting his proposed German alliance to the full Ottoman cabinet for genuine deliberation and debate, Enver worked through a small, trusted circle of like-minded officials, presenting the rest of the government with an essentially completed arrangement rather than a genuine policy choice still open for meaningful discussion. This pattern of concentrated, unaccountable decision-making by a small ruling clique, rather than any broader process of considered national strategy, would characterize Ottoman governance throughout the war years that followed, with catastrophic consequences borne overwhelmingly by ordinary soldiers and civilians who had no voice whatsoever in the fateful decisions being made on their behalf. The broader ideological climate that produced the Young Turk movement combined genuine, sincere reformist idealism with an increasingly assertive strain of Turkish nationalism that grew markedly more pronounced following the traumatic territorial losses of the Balkan Wars. Where earlier Ottoman reform movements had generally emphasized preserving the empire's traditional multi-ethnic, multi-religious character, while modernizing its institutions along more meritocratic and efficient lines, the Young Turk leadership increasingly embraced a narrower vision, centered specifically on Turkish national identity, a shift that alienated many of the empire's substantial non-Turkish populations, including Arabs, Armenians, and various other minority groups who had previously found reasonable accommodation within the older, more explicitly multi-ethnic imperial framework the Ottomans had maintained across previous centuries. British political leader Winston Churchill championed an ambitious naval strategy aimed at forcing the narrow Dardanelles Strait, seizing Istanbul directly, and knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war in a single swift, decisive stroke, a plan promising to open a crucial supply route to Russia while simultaneously eliminating one of Germany's key wartime allies. On March 18, 1915, a combined British and French naval fleet attempted to force its way through the heavily fortified strait, only to suffer catastrophic losses from Ottoman naval mines and coastal artillery, sinking several capital ships and forcing a humiliating naval withdrawal that shattered any hope of achieving victory through naval power alone. Rather than abandoning the campaign entirely following this naval setback, Allied commanders pivoted to a large-scale amphibious land invasion, deploying substantial numbers of Australian and New Zealand troops, forces that would become permanently known to history by their acronym ANZAC, alongside British and French units, in what became known as the Gallipoli Campaign. What followed was a grueling, horrific experience of trench warfare under conditions of extraordinary brutality, with opposing forces sometimes separated by mere meters of contested ground, locked in a static, bloody stalemate that would drag on for nearly a full year without either side achieving any meaningful strategic breakthrough, despite staggering casualties on both sides. It was during this brutal campaign that a previously obscure Ottoman military officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later transform Turkish history under the name Ataturk, first emerged as a genuinely inspirational battlefield commander. Facing a critical moment when his forces risked being overwhelmed, he reportedly issued orders to his men that have become legendary in Turkish military history. Rather than simply commanding an advance, he told them plainly that he was not ordering them to attack, but ordering them to die, buying crucial time with their own lives until reinforcements could arrive. A stark, almost brutally honest appeal to duty and sacrifice that helped hold the critical defensive line. By the time Allied forces finally acknowledged the campaign's failure and withdrew in humiliating defeat, the fighting had claimed well over 500,000 total casualties between both sides combined, dead and wounded together, representing one of the most costly and ultimately futile campaigns of the entire First World War. The Ottoman Empire had achieved a genuine, significant military victory, successfully defending its capital against a determined Allied assault. But the cost in Ottoman lives and resources had been severe, leaving the empire's already strained military capacity further depleted precisely when it could least afford additional losses on other active fronts. The conditions endured by ordinary soldiers on both sides throughout the Gallipoli campaign left a profound and lasting impression on virtually everyone who survived the experience, regardless of nationality. Extreme heat, chronic shortages of clean water, rampant disease spreading through cramped trench networks, and the constant, grinding proximity of death created a shared, almost universal experience of suffering that transcended the nominal battle lines dividing the two exhausted armies. This shared trauma would later contribute to an unusual, genuinely respectful post-war relationship between Turkey and the Australian and New Zealand nations, whose soldiers had fought and died there in such staggering numbers, with Gallipoli eventually becoming a site of solemn annual commemoration and pilgrimage for Anzac descendants, and Turkish authorities themselves later offering notably gracious tributes honouring the soldiers who had died fighting against their own nation on that same brutal peninsula. Mustafa Kemal's emergence as a genuine national hero during the Gallipoli campaign carried significance extending far beyond the immediate battlefield success he achieved there. His demonstrated tactical brilliance and personal courage under fire earned him widespread respect and recognition throughout the Ottoman military establishment, at precisely the moment when the empire's political and military leadership, more broadly, was proving catastrophically incompetent across nearly every other active front of the war. This reputation, forged specifically in the brutal trenches of Gallipoli, would prove absolutely essential several years later, when Kemal needed to rally scattered, demoralized Turkish forces around his own leadership during the subsequent war for national independence. Without the credibility and battlefield legitimacy earned defending the homeland at Gallipoli, it remains genuinely unclear whether Turkish nationalist forces would have rallied so effectively behind his eventual leadership during that later, equally decisive struggle. Ottoman forces launched an ambitious offensive against the strategically vital Suez Canal, a critical artery of British imperial communication and trade, connecting Europe to India and the wider British colonial empire in Asia. But this campaign ultimately ended in failure, unable to overcome determined British colonial defences protecting this crucial waterway. Recognizing that direct military confrontation alone was unlikely to secure decisive victory across the vast desert territories of the Middle East, British strategists pursued a complementary approach, actively encouraging and supporting rebellion from within Ottoman-controlled Arab territories, cultivating relationships with regional Arab leadership centered around the holy city of Mecca, and offering promises of eventual Arab independence in exchange for active military rebellion against continued Ottoman rule. This effort found its most famous and enduring symbol in the figure of British officer T.E. Lawrence, subsequently immortalized in popular history and film as Lawrence of Arabia, who worked directly alongside Arab tribal forces, providing crucial military expertise and coordination that helped transform loosely organized tribal fighters into an effective guerrilla force capable of conducting sustained, disruptive attacks against critical Ottoman infrastructure, most notably the strategically vital Hejaz Railway that supplied Ottoman garrisons throughout the Arabian Peninsula. The resulting desert campaign combined elements of conventional and psychological warfare across enormous, punishing distances, with supply lines stretching for hundreds of miles across brutal desert terrain that tested the endurance of every force involved in the sprawling, difficult-to-control conflict. Yet the promises that had helped secure crucial Arab military cooperation concealed a fundamental, calculated betrayal that would shape Middle Eastern political geography for the following century and beyond. Even as British officials publicly promised full Arab independence in exchange for rebellion against Ottoman rule, British and French diplomats had already secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a confidential arrangement dividing the anticipated post-war Middle Eastern territories directly between British and French colonial control, rather than honouring the independence that had been promised to their Arab allies. Combined Arab and British forces ultimately succeeded in capturing the crucial cities of Jerusalem and Damascus, effectively ending centuries of continuous Ottoman administrative control over the broader Middle Eastern region. This dramatic territorial loss and the deep, lasting sense of betrayal generated by the secret Sykes-Picot arrangement once its details eventually became public knowledge would go on to directly shape decades of subsequent Middle Eastern political instability, contributing significantly to regional conflicts and grievances that continue to influence international relations in the region to this very day. T. Lawrence's own later writings and reflections reveal a man deeply conflicted about his role in this campaign of calculated betrayal, having personally made promises of Arab independence to allies he had come to respect and admire, only to watch those same promises quietly discarded by his own government's secret diplomatic arrangements. His subsequent memoir, detailing his wartime experiences in the desert, along with the enormous popular fame that followed him afterward, helped ensure that this particular episode of imperial betrayal remained embedded in Western popular historical memory, in a way that many other, arguably equally significant colonial betrayals of the era never achieved, even as the practical territorial and political consequences of the Sykes-Picot arrangement itself continued shaping Middle Eastern conflicts and grievances for generations following the war's actual conclusion. The broader Arab revolt also exposed deep divisions and competing visions within the Arab nationalist movement itself, tensions that would persist long after Ottoman forces had been driven from the region entirely. Different Arab leaders and factions held genuinely divergent visions for what a post-Ottoman Middle East should actually look like, ranging from a unified pan-Arab state stretching across the entire region to more localized, city-based or tribal power structures reflecting existing regional loyalties and rivalries that had persisted for centuries under nominal Ottoman administration. These internal divisions, compounded by the external betrayal represented by Sykes-Picot and subsequent colonial mandate arrangements, meant that the collapse of Ottoman authority created not a clean transition toward Arab self-determination as had been promised, but rather a complex, often violent contest over the region's future that would continue playing out across the following century. Enver Pasha, having convinced himself of his own strategic brilliance, personally commanded a disastrous Ottoman offensive against Russian forces in the brutal winter conditions of the Caucasus Mountains, a catastrophically miscalculated campaign that resulted in the death of tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers from exposure and freezing conditions alone, quite apart from actual combat casualties, representing one of the most devastating self-inflicted military disasters of the entire war for the Ottoman side. Rather than accepting responsibility for this catastrophic strategic failure, Ottoman authorities instead sought a convenient scapegoat, formally accusing the empire's substantial Armenian Christian minority population of active disloyalty and collaboration with invading Russian forces, allegations that provided political cover for what would follow while lacking credible, substantiated evidence supporting the sweeping collective accusation against an entire ethnic and religious community. In April 1915, Ottoman authorities issued formal orders for the mass forced deportation of Armenian populations from their traditional homeland territories toward the harsh Syrian desert region around Deir ez-Zor, deportation marches conducted under conditions deliberately calculated to inflict maximum suffering and mortality on the displaced civilian population being forcibly relocated. What followed became one of history's most devastating and thoroughly documented humanitarian catastrophes. Forced death marches across brutal desert terrain, systematic mass killings, widespread sexual violence, and deliberate starvation that together claimed the lives of an estimated 1 to 1.5 million Armenian men, women, and children, a systematic campaign of destruction that international scholarship and numerous national governments have subsequently formally recognized and classified as genocide. This historical reckoning remains bitterly, actively contested to the present day. While the overwhelming scholarly historical consensus, along with the formal recognition of numerous national governments and international bodies, classifies these events unambiguously as genocide, the modern Turkish state has maintained persistent, official denial of this classification for over a century, characterizing the mass deaths instead as tragic wartime casualties resulting from broader regional conflict and instability, rather than a systematic, centrally directed campaign of ethnic destruction, an ongoing, deeply painful historical and political dispute that continues to shape diplomatic relations and historical memory across the region, even in the present day. The scholarly and documentary record supporting the genocide classification has grown substantially in recent decades, drawing on Ottoman government telegrams, contemporary diplomatic reports from neutral nations, including the United States, and various European consular officials stationed throughout the affected regions during the events themselves, and extensive survivor testimony collected across the following century. This body of evidence has led the overwhelming majority of professional historians specializing in the period, along with dozens of national parliaments and international bodies, to formally affirm the genocide classification, despite persistent, often politically charged, official Turkish government resistance to this characterization, a historical dispute that remains one of the most contentious and diplomatically sensitive unresolved legacies connected to the empire's final, catastrophic decade of existence. Beyond the staggering human toll, the events of 1915 permanently and irrevocably altered the demographic, cultural, and economic composition of Anatolia itself, erasing communities that had maintained continuous presence in the region for well over 1,000 years prior to that catastrophic spring. Armenian churches, schools, businesses, and entire towns simply ceased to exist within the span of a few short years, their populations killed, displaced, or forcibly assimilated, representing a rupture in the region's historical and cultural fabric, whose full consequences continue to be studied, debated, and mourned by historians, descendants of survivors, and affected communities scattered now across the global Armenian diaspora that formed directly in the wake of this catastrophic displacement and mass killing. By the closing months of 1918, with Germany's own war effort finally collapsing under the combined weight of Allied military pressure, the Ottoman Empire formally sought an armistice, acknowledging total defeat in a war that had cost the empire enormous territory, resources, and human life. The Three Pashas, whose secret gamble had dragged the empire into this catastrophic conflict, fled into foreign exile, only to be tracked down and assassinated in subsequent years by Armenian activists seeking retribution for the genocide their policies had directly enabled. The formal Treaty of Sèvres, imposed on the defeated Ottoman state in 1920, proved almost unimaginably harsh in its terms, effectively partitioning the remaining Ottoman heartland itself among the victorious Allied powers as though dividing spoils, with Istanbul placed under direct British occupation and vast additional territories carved away entirely, leaving what remained of Ottoman sovereignty reduced to a small, humiliated fragment of its former self. The empire's final sultan, Mehmed VI, chose to accept these devastating, humiliating terms in a desperate effort to preserve at least the nominal appearance of his own royal position, a decision that provoked widespread outrage and disgust among ordinary Turkish citizens who viewed such capitulation as an unforgivable betrayal of national dignity and sovereignty. Into this atmosphere of national humiliation and outrage stepped the same Mustafa Kemal who had distinguished himself so dramatically at Gallipoli years earlier. Refusing to accept the Sèvres settlement's crushing terms, Kemal organized and led a determined nationalist resistance movement, successfully rallying scattered Turkish military forces into an effective fighting force capable of driving occupying Greek and British forces entirely out of the Anatolian heartland through a hard-fought war of national independence. Between 1922 and 1924, the consequences of this successful independence struggle unfolded with dramatic finality. The centuries-old Ottoman Sultanate was formally and permanently abolished, followed shortly afterward by the complete dissolution of the equally ancient Islamic Caliphate institution the Ottoman sultans had claimed to embody. The final sultan departed into permanent foreign exile, bringing to an absolute, definitive close a dynasty and imperial structure that had endured for exactly 6 centuries. In its place arose the modern, secular Republic of Turkey, a fundamentally new nation built directly from the political and territorial wreckage of the fallen empire. The Ottoman Empire's complete historical arc stands as one of history's most striking illustrations of a state that lived by the sword across 6 extraordinary centuries of conquest, cultural achievement, and calculated brutality, and ultimately died not from any single decisive military defeat, but from a catastrophic modern strategic gamble, placed by a small handful of ambitious men who chose precisely the wrong side, in precisely the wrong war, at precisely the worst possible moment in the empire's long, remarkable history. Mustafa Kemal's subsequent transformation of the newly founded Turkish Republic extended far beyond simply defeating occupying foreign armies and abolishing the old imperial institutions. Adopting the surname Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks, he pursued a sweeping program of secularization and modernization that touched nearly every aspect of Turkish public life. From replacing the Arabic script with a Latin-based alphabet to abolishing religious courts in favor of secular legal codes modeled on European systems, to granting women expanded legal and political rights decades ahead of many comparable nations of the era. In this sense, the same relentless drive toward decisive, sweeping transformation that had once built the Ottoman Empire across 6 centuries of conquest, found one final, powerful expression, not in further imperial expansion, but in the deliberate, thorough dismantling of that empire's own inherited traditions, clearing space for an entirely new kind of nation to rise from the ashes of what 6 centuries of Ottoman rule had left behind. The comparison between the Ottoman Empire's final collapse and the birth of the modern Turkish Republic offers one of history's more striking illustrations of dramatic national reinvention following catastrophic imperial failure. Where the Ottoman state had spent its final century desperately and largely unsuccessfully attempting piecemeal reform while clinging to inherited religious and dynastic institutions increasingly out of step with the modernizing pressures of the surrounding world, the new Turkish Republic under Ataturk pursued a fundamentally different strategy: complete, decisive institutional rupture rather than gradual accommodation, deliberately severing the new nation's formal identity from 6 centuries of imperial and religious tradition in favor of an entirely reconceived secular national project. Whether this dramatic strategy of total transformation proved wiser than the earlier, more cautious reform efforts of the late Ottoman period remains a subject of genuine historical debate, but the resulting Turkish Republic's subsequent stability and durability across the following century stands in striking contrast to the chaotic final decades of the empire it replaced.